mainstay of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura ki. So we're going to sing this song, a special song, written by Narottam Das Thakur. Yanila Pramadana Karuna Katu Thakura Divine love, and he was filled with compassion and mercy. Where has such a personality as Srinivas gone?
Where are Master Damodar and Rupa Goswami? Where is Sanatan? Where is Raghunatha, the saviour of the fallen?
Where are my Raghunath Bhatta and Gopal Bhatta? And where is Krishna Goswami? Where is Lord Gauranga, the great dancer of southern God?
I will smash my head against the rock and enter into the fire. Where will I find Lord Gauranga, the reservoir of all wonderful qualities?
Being unable to obtain the association of Lord Gauranga, accompanied by all these devotees in whose association he performed his pastimes, Narottama Dasa simply weeps.
It's a special song. Actually, this song is sung by Narottam Das Thakur. This Narottam Das Thakur, he was the last of the great acharyas in that period of time when all the Goswamis were here. And he was always thinking, even as a young boy, he was always meditating, when can I get to Vrindavan and associate with Sanatan and Rupa Goswami and all the devotees there. And when he finally got to go to Vrindavan, he got there, he found out that they'd all left their bodies, they've all gone back to the spiritual world. And he was just fell down and he was just crying, in separation of these great souls. And this is a song that he wrote, a beautiful song. And we always sing it on the disappearance day of famous acharyas coming in out of the succession. Yeah, so today is the disappearance day of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And so Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he was born in September in 1838 on a Sunday, and he was born in Nadia, which is a district of West Bengal. And he was given the name Kedarnath, which is the name of Lord Shiva, by his father. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he's a Nitya Siddha devotee. A Nitya Siddha devotee means he's an eternally liberated soul. It means he's a member of Krishna's inner circle of very confidential devotees in Goloka Vrindavan. And he was sent by Krishna on a special mission to revive the pure teachings of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and rescue everyone from their confusion. Because at that time, even though Lord Chaitanya had appeared hundreds of years before, his pure teachings had been kind of more or less disarrayed, lost. People confused, people concocting different versions, and even in the name of his teachings were just performing all sorts of atrocious activities. So this inner life, it is said that the inner life of an eternally realized soul like Bhaktivinoda Thakur can never be really fully understood. Their inner life can only be traced through their writings, in which their deep realizations and their personal ecstasies and their love for Krishna are revealed. So as far as words can describe them, this is especially true of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. He wrote so many amazing books, and where he just revealed his personal experiences, his transcendental ecstasies, his love for Krishna. And he made tremendous efforts to communicate Sri Chaitanya Maha's messages to the world through his books, his magazine publications, his door-to-door preaching, his public addresses, his lectures. So, because of his incredible writings and his deep realizations and his preaching activities, he was justly honored as the seventh Goswami. And which by the spiritual authorities at that time recognized that he was on an equal level to the six Goswamis of Vrindavan. And that because they were the principal disciples of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So he was a special personality. And as he grew up, actually, throughout his school years, he was always winning medals of honor for his brilliant scholarship. And during his university years, he developed a great talent as a philosopher and debater. And actually at this time he became fascinated, with deism and devotion to God. He studied many books. Actually he was incredibly well read very well read person, and he read practically. He did a very deep study of the science of God in all the different religions, the Bible, the Quran, the Vedas, and he became very astute in understanding all the famous Western scholars and philosophers' works. So, actually, it was during this time, when he was at university, he went on a tour of the holy places of Vrindavan, Mathura, Orissa, and he started noticing at that time that the younger generations of people in India were turning their back on their spiritual traditions, this Vedic culture. So, the amazing thing is that although Bhaktivinoda Thakur, we read, he was an eternal associate of the Lord, one of Krishna's inner circle of confidential devotees in Vrindavan, a personal servant of Shri Radha and Krishna. At this time in his life, he wasn't conscious of that fact, that he was part of the Lord's plan to re-establish the pure teachings of Lord Chaitanya. He didn't know. Or he didn't even really understand what pure, genuine Vaishnava Dharma actually is. He even seemed a little bewildered. At a glance, when you just look at him at that time, he just appeared to be a typical Bengali intellectual, a product of the British education system and Calcutta literary scene, a student of European philosophers. And this is why you'll find many mundane scholars misinterpret or misunderstand him in their writings. There was even one story, one man, he came to Bhaktisiddhanta, because Bhaktisiddhanta was Bhaktivinoda Thakur's son. And he said, I knew your father. Yeah, he was a great magistrate, he was loved by all the people, he was this and he was that. Bhaktisiddhanta said, you didn't know my father. He said, yes, I did. He was this and he was that and he did this and he had so many accomplishments. Bhaktisiddhanta said, you didn't know my father. And then he started explaining to him, the position of a Nityasiddha devotee and who he actually really was. So Srila Prabhupada, in this connection, even devotees came to Prabhupada in the early days. They were also a bit confused about Bhaktivinoda Thakur. How he seemed just like a worldly person. He didn't really, Prabhupada explained that sometimes even liberated souls like Arjuna play the part of a conditioned soul, just so Krishna could enlighten him by speaking Bhagavad Gita. We see that Arjuna, he was presenting himself as a conditioned soul, and he was asking all these questions, and Krishna was enlightening him in the Bhagavad Gita, just to teach us. So Srila Prabhupada explained that these things are conducted by Krishna in terms of place, audience and time. And actually it is said in the Chaitanya Charitamrita that the activities of a pure Vaishnava cannot be understood, even by the great scholars and philosophers and religionists. So Srila Prabhupada explained that we have to ultimately understand everything through the transcendental via medium of a spiritual master. So whatever Bhaktivinoda Thakur did at particular times in his life was just to suit time, place and circumstance. There's no contradiction in his activities. And it is said, actually, only by the mercy of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu can we fully understand the nature of a pure devotee, or one who is situated in pure love of Godhead. So we should always remember that Bhaktivinoda Thakur was never just a conditioned soul of this world. And his eternal spiritual identity was that of Kamala Manjari. You know, Kamala Manjari, these Manjaris are the very young maidservants of Radha and Krishna, just young girls. And you know, they actually are able to enter into the very intimate, confidential pastimes of Radha and Krishna. And they perform this varieties of services, very specialized services, like, you know, looking after Radharani's hair and dressing her, and, you know, they do all these little things, you know, they take the love notes from Krishna to Radha and Radha to Krishna. And they have very beautiful forms like Radharani. And they're very, very dear to Radha and Krishna. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur was one of these Manjaris, these very young, intimate maidservants of Radha and Krishna. I just imagine. So Krishna actually sent him here to this material world, and he appeared in the form of Bhaktivinoda Thakur to carry out this very important mission of re-establishing the pure teachings of Lord Chaitanya. So at the age of 30 years old, in 1868, he was appointed deputy magistrate. He's a very senior position, it's like a high court judge. And by Krishna's arrangement, he was transferred to a new district where Vaishnava traditions are very strong. And it was there that he received his first copy of the Chaitanya Charitamrita and Srimad Bhagavatam. And when he got these books by Krishna's arrangement, he just developed this sincere desire to understand the very essence of pure Vaishnava Dharma. So he prayed to the Lord in great humility, and then the Lord reciprocated with him. And what did he do? He lifted this Yogamaya covering of his pure devotee. And then that, as a direct result, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, natural spiritual character as a pure devotee, Nityasiddha devotee, began to emerge. Within a short time, he was manifesting all the symptoms of a liberated soul. You know, Krishna had hidden this great Mahabhagavat devotee from the world. Now the covering was removed. And then Bhaktivinoda Thakur's great mission, reviving Lord Chaitanya's mission, was to begin. And what better person could have been chosen for this job? To preach to the intelligentsia of the day. Now Bhaktivinoda Thakur was a person who was fully conversant with all the religions, all the philosophies, with all the burning issues of the day. He had a very substantial intellectual background, respectable social origins, and he was a pure devotee. He was incredibly qualified to take on this very difficult mission. And he was also a deputy magistrate, very distinguished person in society, a recognized, respectable figure whose opinion would be seriously heard and in whose footsteps people would follow. So you couldn't have found a more qualified person to take on this mission. And at this time, he would spend days and nights just reading and writing and studying. Then he began lecturing. Very powerful lecturer, teacher. And he was attacking all this bogus philosophies and, you know, the Christians, the modern intellectuals who were giving impersonal, imperfect opinions about Vaishnavism and Vedic literature. And he was really like, you know, smashing them. But it is said that he was so expertly cutting the illusion and attachments and misconceptions of these conditioned souls. But at the same time, he had this great art of being able to present the truth in such a beautiful, palatable, poetically and wonderful way that even though he was smashing all these philosophies and people who were misinterpreting their scriptures, all these hearers were completely pleased. No one ever felt offended. So if you study the history of India at this particular time in the 1800s, you'll understand that Bhaktivinoda Thakur had a lot to contend with in trying to establish these teachings, this Lord Chaitanya Sankirtan movement, these original pure teachings of Lord Chaitanya, Gaudiya Vaishnavism. What happened is, the English for a start, and everyone knows the English, they went to India, they subjugated India, and they established educational institutions. And then they had a big debate whether they should keep Indian traditional Vedic literature in the schools. So they brought all these big pundits in from England to study the Vedas. And they were thinking, and then they to decide whether they were going to keep it in, and they said this Vedic knowledge is so far-fetched. We're reading about 15-foot high kings that lived for 10,000 years, and there's oceans of milk and yogurt, and there's this Krishna who they claim to be God was stealing things, he was killing people. This is just outrageous, this is just total mythology. And so they took it out of the universities, all the Vedic knowledge and books. And then what happened is all those Indian intellectuals who were trained in British schools and universities began supporting their British lecturers. That the Vedas, the Puranas were simply fascinating collections of mythological tales that had very little to do with reality. And at this time also, there were so many so-called Indian reformers, and they were doing crazy things actually. They were trying to fuse together like Christianity and Vedic philosophy. They're coming up with all these different, groups, concocted groups, concocting their own philosophies and religions, misleading so many people. And there's all these deviant Sahaja groups who are doing all sorts of atrocities, like just breaking every single principle, but justifying their acts in relation to the teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Real deviant. And so many people, especially in the villages, who are very simple people, they got really, sucked into all this bogus stuff. So despite, all these obstacles, Bhaktivinoda Thakur was enormously successful in his work and it was also carried on by his, famous son, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. So in 1871, he moved to Jagannath Puri, and he became deeply immersed in studying and writing. He became well versed in all Vaishnava philosophies, and almost every evening he would go to the Jagannath Temple. He would hear and chant and associate with the Vaishnavas, lecture on Srimad Bhagavatam. He would visit various holy places in Puri, and he would go to these holy places and he would just sit and chant and hear Krishna Katha. Here in Jagannath Puri, we know Lord Chaitanya, he spent 18 years there in Jagannath Puri. His heart was just filled with deep spiritual sentiments. He was just totally absorbed in remembering the wonderful pastimes of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And here in Puri, he wrote more than 100 books. You know, generally if a writer can write 5 or 6 books in his lifetime, he's considered to be a very accomplished scholar. So you may think, how did he write 100 books? Impossible. So to achieve this, he followed a very strict, disciplined daily routine. He was never idle. He used to take rest about 7:30, 8 o'clock. Then after sleeping just for 2 hours, he would wake up at 10 and he'd just start writing. And he'd write right through the night. He'd write from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. in the morning. And then he took half an hour rest, chant his japa. If you read this story, you know, he didn't want to get distracted, you know, when he was chanting. He used to sit in like a pantry. It was like a walk-in wardrobe or something. And he had the Maha Mantra there. He would just sit there, just fully focused. He didn't have his mobile phone there or anything like that, you know. It's just a good example. So he'd chant his japa from 4:30 to 7 a.m. He'd study from 7:30 to 8:30. He'd answer letters from he'd study from 7:30 to 8, I think, and from 8 to 8:30 he would answer letters and then receive visitors, because so many people used to come. And if there was no visitors, he'd just continue reading to 9:30. Then he'd rest briefly for like 15 minutes. Then he'd take his bath and take his breakfast. And every day for breakfast he had the same thing: a pint of milk, 2 chapatis and some fruit. Then at 9:55 he would don his uniform and he'd leave with the court in his carriage. And as a magistrate, he wore a coat and pants. It's like the traditional English, but on his neck it is said he had 6 strands of large tulsi beads. And he used to shave his head, and he had a large sikha. So, you know, the English, they didn't really like that too much. But Bhaktivinoda Thakur never cared what anyone thought of it. And in court, he was just amazing. He was so resolute in his decision. He would decide a case practically immediately. And he would not tolerate any cheating, any deception, any upstarts in the court. And all the lawyers and Englishmen were just astounded by his work capacity. You know, he'd start at 10 a.m. when the court began. He would hear 30 to 50 cases a day. Now, what would take a normal magistrate 1.5 or 2 hours to come to a decision, he would come to a decision in 5 minutes. He was so expert. Then at 1 p.m. he would went home, refreshed himself, and he'd come back to the court from 2 to 5. And at 5 p.m. he returned home. Then immediately, he didn't just come home and rest, but immediately he started translating. He was translating the Sanskrit texts into Bengali. Then from 7 to 7:30 he would take his bath and then his evening meal. You know, his evening meal, he took the same thing every day. A pint of milk, 2 chapatis and some rice. You know, even though he was like a deputy magistrate, he had so much money, he lived the simplest of lives. Just like a Goswami, had practically hardly any possessions. He used to eat very simply, very restricted eating, sleeping. And he just, it is said he worked to a pocket watch which means that he was always he was always on schedule, utilizing every moment of the day, inspired by this just intense desire to render devotional service to Krishna and spread the Sankirtan movement. And of course, besides writing books, he wrote so many amazing poems and songs describing his ecstatic emotions and deep realizations. And he was writing many articles in various magazines and newspapers that were circulating through society. Actually, he began his own very popular magazine called the Sajani Tushani. While he was in Jagannath Puri, the commissioner of Jagannath Puri was so pleased to have a person of Bhaktivinoda Thakur's caliber in his district that he asked him to watch over the affairs of the Jagannath Temple. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he took up that responsibility. And actually in the Jagannath Temple, there was a lot of corruption going on, people stealing things, so many malpractices. So he came in there and he got it all straightened out. And he made sure the worship, even the deity worship, was like people just coming in with the offerings at all different times. There was no punctuality. A very terrible standard. And so he came and he brought the standard up to the highest standard. And he would also daily lecture in Srimad Bhagavatam. And actually, in his lectures, he would just inspire so many people. Even staunch Mayavadis, they're the toughest, they're the most envious, once you're riveted into this Mayavadi impersonal philosophy, it's very practically impossible to become a devotee. But somehow or other, by his purity and his incredible preaching, he was able to he converted so many of even the Mayavadis into become staunch devotees, my Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Because it was in Jagannath Puri also, he prayed for a ray of Vishnu. Actually, it's one story. He was giving a lecture in the temple there in Jagannath Puri. I think it was just next to the temple. It was like a little foyer there, and the king of Puri came there with his entourage, and it's like when you go to India, everyone's talking and making this big racket, talking twice as loud as normal people. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he pulled him up. He said, he told him, he really put him in his place. He said, you may be the king, but you should show respect when you come to the temple like this, where the Krishna guitar is being spoken. You may be the king of this Puri, but actually Lord Jagannath, he actually is the real king. And the king was really, he asked for forgiveness. So it was in Jagannath Puri, he actually prayed for a ray of Vishnu, a special sun that could help him carry on his preaching work, because he realized it's such a big job trying to spread Krishna consciousness at this time. So in 1874, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati appeared in answer to his prayer, a special sun that could assist him in his preaching work. And at that time, actually, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he'd been searching for a guru for a long time. Then one night he had this dream. And Lord Chaitanya told him in the dream that his guru was coming tomorrow to initiate him. And sure enough, he received a letter from this wonderful, pure devotee. He was actually a descendant of one of Lord Chaitanya's intimate associates. Said in the letter, I'm coming soon to give you initiation according to Mahaprabhu's desire. So not long after this, Vipina Vihari Goswami came and initiated Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And it was soon after this that Bhaktivinoda Thakur and his wife, and he had 2 children at that time, they went and stayed in Vrindavan for 3 months. And there he met Srila Jagannath Das Babaji. You know, Jagannath Das Babaji was the most powerful acharya at that time. And he actually gave Bhaktivinoda Thakur many spiritual instructions. He later became his instructing spiritual master, his HG Guru. You know, Bhaktivinoda Thakur used to affectionately call him the commander-in-chief of the Vaishnavas. Srila Jagannath Das Babaji. So at the age of 47, he settled in Calcutta. He bought a home. He called it the Bhakti Bhavan. This time, he had 10 children. The big family. And he set up this printing press. They called it the Chaitanya Press. And he started printing and publishing many books. And he's also receiving distinguished guests. You know, kings and dignitaries and English governors and different Brahmins and philosophers who would come and see him. Actually, during this time, he was kind of troubled, frequently troubled with bad health. You know, but however, it is said that even though he was troubled with bad health, his determination to serve Krishna never diminished even slightly. It is said that he always accomplished the superhuman work of a spiritual genius, while simultaneously perfectly performing his material duties to the government, to his family members. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur, as I said, he was a transcendental, Nitya Siddha, eternally liberated soul. He was truly just an embodiment of all wonderful spiritual, godly qualities. And though he was honoured and respected, you know, throughout Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, even though he became so famous and so respected, it is said that he didn't even possess a shadow of vanity or pride. Generally, when a person gets honoured like that, they become a little bit intoxicated, they become a little bit proud. But Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he was just so humble and meek. And although he held very high government posts, he wasn't just very humble, but he was just a kind friend, one and all. Now his sense of universal brotherhood made him just a friend to everyone. Everyone just loved him so dearly. And you know, if you study his history, you will notice he was transferred by the English government to many different places before he actually ended up in Jagannath Puri, then Calcutta. But every time he was transferred, practically the whole town would come out and protest. Why are you taking him away? Because he just becomes so endeared to everyone in the whole town and whole village, wherever he was, that they just, when the thought of him going, they just felt so much separation. And it is said he befriended men of all classes and all creeds. He didn't discriminate. It's like in the Bhagavad Gita we read about the humble sage. By virtue of true knowledge, he sees everyone equally. And he was so charitable. If anyone approached him for help, and many people used to come to him for help, because he was High Court judge, he had a lot of money, they never went away disheartened. He was just giving out his wealth, left, right and centre, to everyone. And also it is said he never bore any grudges, even to those who were jealous of him or attempted to impede him in his spiritual mission. He was always eager just to benefit everyone. He never uttered a word that would injure another's feeling. He never chastised anyone unless he was perfectly confident that he had a right to do so. It was for that purpose's benefit. You know, the Vaishnavas, even when they try and help someone by finding some fault in them, they always instruct them with love. There's no condescending mood there. And his administrative abilities were so marked by the English government officials and Indian kings that sometimes he would be called in frequently. They'd call upon his advice to settle conflicts. And you know, he actually helped stop so many civil wars and so many things, heavy things that were going on in India at that time. Through his expert advice, they were able to, avoid such conflicts. And when he was offered so many honours and titles, he would just humbly tell them that he didn't want any titles. That such titles and honours would interfere with his holy mission. Actually, it was noted that never was there a man found more strict in his observance of moral duties than Bhaktivinoda Thakura. He had this absolute distaste for anything immoral. And this inspired many people to open their eyes and correct themselves. Now, even not just immoral things, but he never drank tea. He never went to the the theatres and movies. These were big things in India, but he avoided all these kind of things. He never ate beetle. So although he held a very high government position, as I said, as a deputy magistrate, was highly paid, he always kept his personal needs to just a bare minimum. He just lived the simplest of lives. And also was noted that in his writings, when he wrote so many books, but he did it in this very special comparative manner, which means he was able to bring the teachings of Lord Chaitanya into the relationship with almost every school of thought prevalent in the world. So expert. It means he made the sacred teachings of Lord Chaitanya fully available to the modern reader. So at the age of 54, he went on an amazing preaching tour, performed Nama Sankirtan everywhere, organising door-to-door preaching. He was one of the fathers who carried on the Namhat preaching from Nityananda Prabhu. And he actually established 500 Namhat centres. That's a lot. And he used to say, I am the street sweeper of the Namhat of Nitai. So he was always busy, instructing, educating his many disciples and followers, and sometimes he'd organise his big Namhat, all these Namhat devotees to come together. 2,000 to 4,000 devotees would come together. They do this in Mayapur actually. They bring all the Namhat groups into Mayapur. They've actually got a whole building there for them, to accommodate them. And they have these big festivals. And there was 2,000 to 4,000 devotees. And they were all chanting and dancing wildly. It's like a HG Garuda, we just chanting and dancing ecstatically and wildly. And he was just invoking the original preaching mood of Gaunitai, Lord Chaitanya and Lord Nityananda. And during these festivals he would preach very strongly, glorifying the holy name, Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, explaining the uselessness of impersonal philosophy. Actually in 1896, we know 1896 was the birth of Srila Prabhupada. So Bhaktivinoda actually predicted at that time, just that year before Prabhupada was born, he predicted that soon a personality will appear that will preach the teachings of Lord Chaitanya and move unrestrictedly all over the world. He actually predicted Prabhupada was coming, he knew. So when Bhaktivinoda Thakur, when he turned 70 years old, he accepted the Babaji initiation. You know, the Babajis, they don't travel, they don't go anywhere, they just sit in one place and chant. So he accepted this Babaji initiation from Srila Garuda Babaji, who was the spiritual master of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. And he got this old loincloth, he put on this old loincloth and begging apron of his beloved instructing spiritual master Jagannath Das Babaji. So he established in Jagannath Puri a place to do his bhajan, a short distance from the samadhi of Haridas Thakur. When you go to Jagannath Puri, you can see that there, that place. And here he just continued his chanting and writing. He was also still accepting disciples. And after a couple of years of this, he felt a strong desire just to be absorbed in his own personal bhajan. So he just went into complete solitude. And he just became fully absorbed and uninterruptedly engaged in meditation on his loving service of Shri Radha and Krishna. And he just entered into this state of complete samadhi, this spiritual trance. We read about that in Narottam Das Thakur too. We read about that, how he just used to go into these meditative trances where he was actually no longer here in this world. He'd gone back to, he was in the spiritual world performing his pastimes as a Manjari. Actually, Narottam, his service in the spiritual world was helping one of the 8 principal gopis making milk sweets for Radha and Krishna. And one time, sometimes he'd be stirring the milk and the pot would boil up and he'd try and stop the milk boiling over and he'd burn his hands. So that was in his meditation, but on earth his hands were burnt. He used to walk around with his bandaged hands and people, no one really knew it, only a few people. So similarly, Bhaktivinoda Thakur used to enter into these meditative trances where he'd go and he'd be serving Radha Krishna in his spiritual form. Then at noon of 1914, at the age of 76, he left this world, he entered the spiritual world, and he took up his position again as a little girl, a young maidservant, intimate maidservant of Radha and Krishna, Kamala Manjari, his eternal pastime. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur ki. So I think we have a little program today. It was usually 10 o'clock. Devotees come here, they sing some bhajans, do some readings from his autobiography, and then just before 12, about 11:45, 10 to 12, we're going to have a Pushpanjali ceremony and a kirtan, and take prasadam at 12:30. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur ki.